Audre Lorde delivered the speech Learning from the 60s at the Malcolm X weekend at Harvard University in 1982. The text is printed in her 1984 collection Sister Outsider. So unsurprisingly, given the theme of the weekend, Audre's focus is on Black liberation. So the opening lines to her speech are, "Malcolm X is a distinct shape in a very pivotal period of my life. I stand here now, Black, lesbian, feminist, an inheritor of Malcolm and in his tradition, doing my work, and the ghost of his voice through my mouth asks each one of you here tonight, are you doing yours?" I'm going to focus on the theme of infighting in her talk, and while she's talking about the Black liberation movement, I want to apply her ideas over to the feminist movement, which, as both a lesbian and a feminist, I'm sure she would have been amenable to. So Audre talks of how Malcolm X had begun to discuss those scars of oppression which lead us to war against ourselves in each other rather than against our enemies. So this immediately gripped my attention because we see it so much inside feminism today, that feminists are most at war with other feminists over disagreements against a background of huge amounts of agreement, rather than most at war with their real enemies, the anti-feminists, the woman haters, the misogynists. So she says that in any move for liberation, we must move against not only those forces which dehumanize us from the outside, but also against those oppressive values which we have been forced to take into ourselves. So this is an important point. A people that has been oppressed does not face only external pressure from outsiders who treat them badly, but it also faces internal pressure because individuals will, to some extent, have internalized outsiders' ideas about themselves. So we have to reject the views of outsiders and reconceive ourselves. If we don't do that, we're at risk of treating each other the way that outsiders treat us, and thereby being a perpetrator of our own group's oppression. Audre says, in the 1960s, the awakened anger of the Black community was often expressed not vertically against the corruption of power and true sources of control over our lives, but horizontally toward those closest to us who mirrored our own impotence. Applying this idea to women, the idea would be that we don't like what we see in other women because we see the kind of powerlessness or helplessness that we feel so frustrated about in ourselves. And we can react to this with anger against other women instead of at men as the oppressors of women or at the social structures that have entrenched male dominance, depending how you understand the mechanisms that sustain sex-based injustice. So I think it's worth quoting her at length here, for what she says about disagreement within the Black community is just as relevant for disagreement between feminists. So she says, "We were poised for attack, not always in the most effective places. When we disagreed with one another about the solution to a particular problem, we were often far more vicious to each other than to the originators of our common problem. Historically, difference had been used so cruelly against us that as a people we were reluctant to tolerate any diversion from what was externally defined as blackness." In the 60s, political correctness became not a guideline for living, but a new set of shackles. A small and vocal part of the Black community lost sight of the fact that unity does not mean unanimity. Black people are not some standardly digestible quantity. In order to work together, we do not have to become a mix of indistinguishable particles resembling a vat of homogenized chocolate milk. So she's saying that there were disagreements about how to solve problems, and that these disagreements often provoked reactions that were stronger than those we'd see against those actually oppressing Black people. So her line, "Unity does not mean unanimity," is significant. We can operate as part of heterogeneous social groups working for change without expecting there to be perfect agreement. Why would there be when we're all so different? And why would we want there to be when disagreement is a sign of a healthy intellectual culture in which ideas can be critically assessed so that the good ones make it through and the bad ones don't? Audre says we must focus our rage for change upon our enemies rather than upon each other. This would mean feminists asking who or what is the real enemy here, and understanding that while we might have these feelings of anger toward each other, they are a further symptom of our oppression and not to be taken at face value. We must redirect them outward to the things that keep women in a subordinate position. And to do this, we also need a clear understanding of the social group we're part of and fighting for. So Audre was talking about the Black community, we're talking about women. She said, by seeing who the we is, we learn to use our energies with greater precision against our enemies than against ourselves. So because we're conscious of the possibility of misdirecting anger at each other, or being intolerant of difference revealed in disagreement that is perfectly acceptable and even useful, a clear understanding of who we are helps to keep that in check. So we think, this person is on my side, they do not deserve my rage. And this is again significant when it comes to women, given that the very concept of woman has become highly contested since Audre gave this speech. So the point is easily made in the case of some feminists. They have forgotten that as women, we're on the same side in seeking women's liberation. But it's also revealing of certain tensions between feminists and men. So a woman who thinks feminism can be for anyone, by anyone, and about anyone, as some contemporary forms of feminism that are more like general global justice movements do, will take the we here to be everyone. And so this advice about who to spare from misdirected rage cannot be applied. Or women who think feminism is only for women, but who disagree over whether men with gender identities are women, will have a disagreement over who should be spared. So one side will think anger at men with gender identities is appropriate because they're not part of the we. The other side will think it's inappropriate because it's making exactly the mistake of focusing our rage for change upon each other rather than upon our enemies. So Audre gives a number of examples of where this kind of infighting occurred in the Black liberation movement. She talks about Black militants fighting Black Muslims, Black nationalists bad-mouthing those committed to non-violence, and men in the Black Power movement telling Black women their only useful position was prone. She talks about Black lesbian and gay people being entirely excluded, Black workers being silenced for not being Black in exactly the right way, a Black woman civil rights activist who'd been beaten and imprisoned for her activism being trashed and silenced simply for having a white husband. And we can probably all supply our own examples of infighting between feminist women in parallel to these examples of infighting between people working for Black liberation. Audre implores her audience, if our history has taught us anything, it is that action for change directed only against the external conditions of our oppressions is not enough. In order to be whole, we must recognize the despair oppression plants within each of us, that thin, persistent voice that says our efforts are useless, it will never change, so why bother, accept it. And we must fight that inserted piece of self-destruction that lives and flourishes like a poison inside of us, unexamined until it makes us turn upon ourselves in each other. That we can put our finger down upon that loathing buried deep within each one of us and see who it encourages us to despise. And we can lessen its potency by the knowledge of our real connectedness, arcing across our differences. If women are despised, then it is not surprising that women are encouraged to despise women. But we can resist this by noticing it and refusing it.